Good morning, First Presbyterian Church. Welcome to Insight class, where we're doing a series on science and religion. And today's class is the second class about artificial intelligence. I'm Matt Wilding, a member here at First Presbyterian, and I'm joined by my colleague and friend, Dave Greve, from the second week in a row. Welcome, Dave.
Hey, Matt. It's great to be back here in my home again.
Well, as I said last week, I'm looking forward to the day where we can welcome you physically at First Presbyterian, Dave. But I'm super happy that we're able to do this class together.
Yeah, me too.
I'm going to go ahead and share some slides, I hope. Okay. Great. As I said, this is our second class on artificial intelligence. Is human intelligence special? And
I think this week we're really going to start to dive into that subtopic, right?
That's right. Last week we talked about artificial intelligence, sort of how it is today, and that class is still on the First Presbyterian YouTube channel, and I'll put a link below this video to that first class in case you want to go back and see the first class. But I really enjoyed the first class, Dave. Talking about artificial intelligence was a lot of fun.
I agree. There were so many examples that we came up with, and as you mentioned last week, a lot of times AI, especially in science fiction movies, is portrayed as something scary or ominous. But I think, from our experience or our discussion last week, what we saw was that, there's a lot of AI technology that we're experiencing today, right now. And it's not that scary. I mean, there's downsides, there's challenges that we need to overcome. But by and large, this is a technology that I think can help to make our lives easier.
That's right. Like we talked about last week, it was just a few years ago that artificial intelligence was the technology of the future.
Yep.
And it was really something that was in the future. Now there's just example after example after example of applications of artificial intelligence. And we talked last week specifically about three of them: self-driving cars, automatic translation programs, and then deepfake technology. And talked about some of the ethical considerations and sort of what the state of the art was. So that was a lot of fun, and in some ways it was kind of the easier of the two classes, wasn't it? Because we could just talk about today.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I mean, again, we chose three areas. There's so many different areas that this technology is having an impact. But we chose three examples that I think, plausibly you'll encounter in the near term.
Right. So go ahead.
But yeah, looking forward, this week's class is really about sort of AI tomorrow, looking ahead at this technology. And, whereas last week's class was sort of very concrete and we talked a lot about specific examples, this week's class is not really going to be so much about answers as it is about questions. The question of where can this technology go and what are the limits of this technology? And frankly, these are questions that have challenged the great thinkers, both in computer science, where this is emerging from, and in philosophy. AI, the technology is so exciting because it really is. It's right on the boundary of what's possible. It's on the edge of technology today, and it's pushing on the edges of philosophy. The question of what can we actually accomplish going forward. And so a lot of this week's discussion is going to involve questions more so than answers.
You're absolutely right, David. Challenging the great minds of today, and you and me.
And us. So, so speaking of sort of what's possible and where we're going with technology, Another science fiction author, these guys are always at the forefront. Arthur C. Clarke postulated 3 laws of technology. And in some ways, these are kind of funny, but in some ways, they're kind of serious. His first law: when a distinguished but elderly scientist states that something is possible, he is almost always right. When he states that something is impossible, he is very probably wrong. This is a sort of funny, almost maybe ironic sort of statement about kind of where technology is heading and the way people think about it. It's easy to say, no, 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 that'll never happen. But a lot of times what we've seen is that scientists and science has come up with solutions, even to the strangest things, like in Star Trek teleportation. Today, we have examples of that at the quantum level. So there's always somebody pushing the edges of those technologies. And that's what I was talking about earlier, about AI being on the boundary of technology. The second law is the only way of discovering the limits of the possible is to venture a little way past them into the impossible. And the technologies that are right on the edge, so AI is one of them, is really pushing the boundaries, again, not just of technology, but of the way we think about technology and the way we think about what's possible. And then finally, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And in a lot of ways, this rule, this law of technology, sort of captures sort of the evolution of science, right? The idea that we sort of move from myth and superstition about the way the world works into some sort of a science, some sort of a description. And as we do that, as we're able to understand the way the world works, the way the technologies work, we're able to leverage that and we're able to use it, right? We can make it do things, do our bidding, so to speak, and as we're seeing, hopefully make the world better along the way.
Right. Dave, you told me the story once about being in school, and this picture on the lower right-hand corner is a picture of the HAL computer from 2001.
Right.
You told me a story. I know it's not super relevant, but maybe you could tell it to our audience.
Yeah, so going back into the late 80s, early 90s. So Arthur C. Clarke wrote actually the book 2001: A Space Odyssey. And HAL was the super intelligent computer that was helping to run the ship. So I was in graduate school at the University of Illinois, and I went into a computer lab, one of the newest computer labs on campus. And I was very excited. They have the newest Mac computers in there. And I took my disk and I put it in the thing, put it in the computer and did my work. And I was getting ready to leave. And I wanted to eject my disk. And I pressed a button on the computer. And the computer said, "I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that." And at that moment, I was really at a loss. My first question was, how does that computer know who I am? How does it know my name? Because I didn't log in. It wouldn't have known I was Dave. Why is it talking to me? Well, it turns out this is just a standard error response that the computer makes when something goes wrong. And it's from the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. This is what HAL tells the astronaut, Dave. "I'm sorry, Dave, I can't open the pod bay doors." But it took me off guard, right? I knew that these computers were advanced, but this technology really took me by surprise. But it turned out it was just a movie clip. It wasn't real.
I love that story.
So we're going to talk about intelligence, I guess, in general. And so I think with this slide, what we're trying to do is kind of have a background for this concept as it occurs naturally. And I think normally when we think about intelligence, we're really fundamentally talking about things that usually are alive in natural intelligence, right? And so we're talking about things like humans and plants and animals, but even the definition of life in the scientific community, based on Wikipedia, there's really no consensus as to what's alive. And so you really notice this as you begin to push the boundaries of this definition, and you start asking questions, well, what about a virus? Is a virus alive? You can go even farther than that and talk about like a prion. And this is what leads to mad cow disease. Is that a living organism? Well, you know, there's certain ways in which it is, and there's others in which it's not. And then you can get more philosophical, and you can start talking about something like a city, right? You talk about a vibrant life in a city. Is the city sort of alive? Or even the church. Paul talks about the church as an organism, right, with hands and feet and eyes and mouths. But you know, is it really alive? I don't know. It depends on how you define life. And so we think of intelligence as being associated with life in the natural world, but also intelligence doesn't have a good definition. According to Wiki, the definition of intelligence is controversial. In some sense, I think, much like life, to the average person, it's like, well, I kind of know it when I see it, right? I'll recognize intelligence when it crops up. But I think we typically would say that the things that are alive that are intelligent include humans and animals. But then you start to, again, press the boundaries a little bit. So what about like ants and an ant colony? Is the ant colony intelligent, right? They move and behave in a way that it's almost as if it's one organism. And yet, is there a particular decision maker? Does every ant know what the whole colony is doing? Probably not. So in some ways that becomes an emergent behavior, like Dory talking to the shoal of fish in Finding Nemo, right? She's asking this group of fish questions and it's responding through caricatures to help her out, right? But does each fish in the shoal know what it's doing? That's a tough question. And then finally, sort of at the pinnacle of this is we're talking about consciousness, right? I think, therefore I am. This idea of sort of self-awareness. And again, you know, the farther we go in this sort of hierarchy of concepts, the less precise the definitions are. And as the quote from Wiki says, despite centuries of analysis, they really don't have a consensus on what consciousness even means. But you know, we think of humans as possessing this quality. Are we unique in that? Maybe, maybe not. Does consciousness just emerge as a natural result of intelligence? That's a good question too, but hard to answer.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. There's been a number of, as you know, Dave, there's been a number of attempts to formulate a definition for some of these concepts. And in particular, maybe the most famous of these kinds of definitions is something called the Turing Test, which is a way of, at least a claimed way of deciding whether a machine is intelligent. And there's a picture here of somebody running this test, and the idea is, well, maybe intelligence is fundamentally what people do. So if we could have a machine, which is marked A, and a person marked B, and they have some sort of interface to a second person marked C, that could communicate with both A and B and be able to pose questions to the machine, pose questions to the human. And if the machine is able to mimic a human to the extent that a human cannot tell them apart, then that means that the machine is intelligent. And that was something that was proposed by Alan Turing, who's a famous computer scientist, quite some time ago. And this is kind of a famous way of trying to of running an experiment to judge the intelligence of a machine.
Yeah.
It's something, Dave, that you've complained about this Turing test for years, and I never you've only now been able to persuade me.
Yeah, it's
not a very good definition.
It's a hot button issue for me, right? I mean, we saw on the last slide, right? There's not a lot of consensus even on what intelligence means in the natural world. And so trying to capture what an artificial intelligence or machine intelligence might be is sort of a Herculean effort, I guess. But really this is the standard in some sense for general artificial intelligence, like we talked about last week, intelligence that sort of replicates human behavior. But you know, frankly, this idea, this concept it's not very useful. It's not really a specification for what intelligence is. It's more of just the litmus test, right? I'll know it when I see it, or a person would know it if they saw it. But that's not useful from an engineering perspective. It's not something you can sort of build on. And then there's the question of what is it really measuring? Is it measuring the humanity of what you're dealing with, or is it measuring some notion of general intelligence? And the reason that that's important is because they've run this challenge a number of different times, and the first declared winner, so to speak, of this challenge was due, at least in part, because it was able to imitate human typing errors. It made mistakes. It was stupid. And so it's more, in more a sense, a measure of artificial stupidity than artificial intelligence. So, right, when you're trying to say, is it a human? Well, it's easy to be sort of a dumb human. But what if you wanted something that was better than human, right? Well, this test is not a good way of measuring, is it human? Does it have human intelligence? Does it have general intelligence?
Your comment a minute ago is absolutely right, which is if it's going to be a description of what intelligence is, it has to be at least specific enough that you could hope to build to it, right? I want to build something. And this approach to defining intelligence is exactly what you said. It's I'll know it when I see it kind of approach, which really doesn't help us in terms of actually trying to construct something.
Right, and so Edgar Dijkstra was sort of very pragmatic computer scientist. Right, his comment, the question of whether a computer can think is no more interesting than the question of whether a submarine can swim. Right, I guess he's just saying, if it computes, it can think. So no sense staring at your navel about it. But I think, again, if we're going to start pushing the boundaries here and try to aim for general artificial intelligence, trying to encapsulate this idea is really, really important.
Right. I think that what Dijkstra was getting at, another way of looking at it is, if you end up arguing about whether a submarine can swim, you always just end up talking about what does it mean to swim. You don't really get at the fundamental question.
So as you said, you're in a series here on science and religion. And so kind of as your guest speaker, I guess maybe I felt obligated to share my view on science and religion. How are they similar? How are they different? And I tried to sort of encapsulate my thoughts anyway on this slide. Right? So to me, the distinction lies in sort of their foundation and their aim. Right? And looking at science, science is sort of founded on this concept of skepticism. A good scientist is maybe from Missouri. Maybe he's doubting Thomas from the scriptures, right? Show me. I need to see. I need to see the holes in his hands and his feet. It's about observation. It's about something that's reproducible and some sort of evidence and proof, right? That's the foundation of science. The foundation of religion, on the other hand, is faith, right? It's not show me, it's believe me. And so from Hebrews, faith is the evidence of things not seen, right? So religion is looking for things that are not visible, that are not observable necessarily. And what are the goals? The goal of science is to sort of explain the natural world, the observable world. And really, to use Asimov, right? Clark's rules of technology, we want to turn magic into technology. We want to turn things that we don't understand into things that we do to make them useful so that we can use them as tools or capabilities. Religion's aim is to explain the spiritual world, right? As Jesus said in John, if you don't understand natural things, how can you understand spiritual things? He's making a distinction between the things that we can observe and the things that we can't. And sort of suggesting at the same time that maybe the world that we live in isn't everything. Maybe it's just a shadow of kind of a larger reality. And we don't get to see that larger reality, but we can at least see its shadow here. And if we can understand that, maybe we have some hope of understanding sort of this larger context. And ultimately, the question, are they in conflict? Well, again, their aims and their foundations are very different. I would say when religion tries to explain natural phenomenon, you're going to start getting into trouble. And similarly, when science starts to impinge on religion, right? There is no God because we can't observe him. That's sort of orthogonal to the purpose of science, which is to explain the natural behaviors.
Thanks, Dave. I should put a plug in for an earlier talk. 2 weeks ago, Dieta Anderson, also a member of our congregation, gave a presentation, a class like this one, that's still on our YouTube channel, that talks about science and religion. She was talking about it in the context of being a high school science teacher and dealing with these kinds of issues, but much the same kind of overall perspective that you're presenting here. And so I can recommend her class from 2 weeks ago.
So is human intelligence special? If we look at it from a scientific perspective, maybe we would tend to say no. Scientists would believe that the universe is guided by natural laws. We're part of that universe. All of the magic that we see today in our intelligence is going to yield to some explanation of science. And so artificial human intelligence is possible. If we understand the natural world and we understand those laws, then we understand how people work and we can replicate that in a machine. Religion, on the other hand, might say, yes, human intelligence is special. We occupy a special place in creation. We're more than the sum of our parts. We're more than just dust. We have access to the spiritual world we have access to that world. And so artificial human intelligence is impossible because you can't replicate that connection that we have to that larger reality. And so these are sort of the competing views, perhaps, between these different modes of thinking about intelligence.
Right. Maybe a little bit more on the science perspective on human intelligence. And first, take a step back and look at how people think about computers. Computation is reducible, if you will, on a computer that you have sitting on your desk. And in some sense, if you look at the electronics, it's built up of electronics. And you could think of it as being composed of a whole bunch of NAND gates that have some sort of logical inputs and outputs. And you can, even though there might be millions of these gates, you can build up a computer of them, and you can understand what the computer does. It's in some sense, if you can understand what that gate does. And that's how a technical person, an engineer or scientist would tend to look at a computer. Yeah, we can build them, we can make them more complicated, and Dave mentioned before that there were emergent behaviors that come out of a piece of equipment like that. But fundamentally, a scientist is going to be optimistic about being able to build things because you can build things and understand how they work, and you can at least, even if you don't understand everything, you can at least replicate things.
Yeah, you can take complicated things and you can sort of break them down into smaller pieces and replicate that behavior, right?
Right. And just the way the human brain also is composed of neurons, that in some sense is very analogous in a human brain. A neuron is very analogous in the human brain to a NAND gate in a computer. It's something that is there's many of them, but nevertheless you can understand basically in some sense, or at least replicate what's going on in the brain if you can build these things out of that same component. And in fact, a lot of artificial intelligence applications today are actually composed of things that sort of mimic the way a neuron works.
Yeah, it's amazing the biologically inspired computing and sort of the capabilities it's been able to demonstrate. It's phenomenal.
Right. So if you're going to be thinking about it as a scientist, and you look at human intelligence and you look at the brain, you're pretty optimistic that things are going to get better and better, and you're going to be able to build things that work like the human brain more and more. And so from that sense, there's no hard and fast rule about it, but I think the science perspective on human intelligence is that maybe it's not special. Maybe we can build things that that use it, and the early examples that, like the ones that we talked about last week, are showing some promise and are actually able to do useful things by able to do useful things, even though they are far, far less complex than a brain.
Right.
So that's sort of the science perspective on this.
Right. And so kind of turning it around and kind of looking at sort of the religious perspective, is human intelligence special? Have we been created special? So, going back to Genesis, right? Genesis says that mankind was created in God's image. And technically one of the verses says it was created in our image. And so as a church, we profess the triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, of three different parts. And so maybe being created in God's image is sort of a reflection of that, right? So we have kind of a living body that we have, and we have a soul. And these sort of map to the concepts we saw earlier: life, intelligence, and consciousness. So the body maps to the living aspect of our existence. The soul perhaps maps to the intelligence. And then there's this notion of a spirit that we might perhaps connect with this idea of consciousness. And this hierarchy also sort of reflects how we think of the natural world as well, right? So we have animals, humans, and plants that all have living bodies, but the intelligence is limited to humans and animals. And we have this idea that perhaps consciousness is limited to humans. And in some ways, you could argue that there's maybe a scriptural support for that, right? If we look at Genesis 2, the Lord formed man from the dust of the ground. He breathed the breath of life into the man's nostrils, and the man became a living person. Right? So the term used in both the Hebrew and Greek for spirit can be translated as breath or wind. And this idea that somehow that this breath came from God and animated us as humans distinguishes us from all the other aspects of creation. We were still formed from the dust, right? So we have a physical component, but there's a spiritual component that sort of came from God. And so we also profess as a church the concept of eternal life. And so this eternal life could possibly be wrapped up in the spirit, right? Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. So dust to dust. So the natural part of our body dies and decomposes and returns to the earth. And the spiritual part of us returns to God. And then Job, we say that the spirit in a person is the spirit, but it is the spirit in a person, the breath of the Almighty, that gives them understanding. So here's a connection between this notion of this eternal spirit and some sort of intelligence, this understanding or consciousness. So possibly from a religious perspective, we can see an interpretation where there is something special about humanity that's not represented just by the atoms and the constituents of our makeup, but is sort of a supernatural dimension. And it's interesting, lots of scientists and people on the edges of technology and understanding often put a religious spin on the things that they're doing. So Ramanujan was a brilliant mathematician in the mid-20th century, and he credited his inspiration. So inspiration was one of the things we talked about last week as a hallmark of intelligence. He attributed his inspiration to a spiritual aspect, right? There was a concept of a family goddess who revealed to him these concepts in mathematics. And he says, an equation for me has no meaning unless it expresses a thought of God. He very much spiritualizes this notion, this intelligence that he possessed, as being somehow connected to a spiritual dimension. So I would say that religion argues that maybe there is something special that couldn't be reproduced with just a machine.
Dave, you're not going to believe it, but we're already at the half-hour mark.
Yeah, well, we're wrapping things up here. Promise or warning. This is one of my favorite verses, I think, in the Bible. Genesis. This is in the context of the Tower of Babel, right? And so in that story, you have humanity building a tower that's going to reach to heaven, and God comes down and sees what's going on, and ultimately confuses the language of the people and scatters them over the face of the earth. But this one verse says, look, he said, the people are united and they all speak the same language. After this, nothing they set out to do will be impossible for them. Now, we don't get a good motivation for why the languages were scattered or were confused in the story. Was it a punishment? What was it? It didn't seem like that. But this verse, to me, if you think of it being written thousands of years ago, is kind of amazing in the way that it speaks to the way science works. Right? So science really grows through the exchange of information and knowledge. And we're seeing right now, even, and we talked about last week, this idea that, the translation app on your phone, it won't be long and we're going to be able to communicate seamlessly with people all across the earth, right? And so this idea that the people being united and speaking the same language are being able to communicate. And when that happens, nothing will be impossible for them, right? And so, going back to Clarke's laws, when a scientist says that something's impossible, he's very probably wrong. This verse is very much in line with that, right? The frontiers are wide open. So is this a promise or a warning? In some sense, maybe there's some reason why the languages were confused, but we're at a point where we're sort of reversing that. And it seems like there's new frontiers that are opening up as this technology continues to mature.
I can't believe that that a half hour has already gone by.
Yeah, no, there's so much to talk about in this area. We could go on for hours. I'm sorry.
I think no, not at all. Super appreciated. I will say that I think it's great that we're wrapping up with a picture from your and my favorite movie, one of our favorite movies.
One of the best movies ever made.
Yes, and if anybody wants to watch The Matrix, which is very much a religious themed movie, watch the first one, but not the second and
it was such a good movie. It's surprising they never made a sequel.
Thanks again, Dave, and we'll look forward to hearing more about this sometime in the future, I hope. And if anybody in the class that's watching this class would like to pose a question or have a follow-up discussion about this, please feel free to contact me, Matt Wilding, and I'll make sure that Dave gets roped into it as well. And you can also just put questions in the YouTube channel of that this class is in. If you'd like to type something in, we will respond to it.
I'd love to do that.
Thanks again, Dave. Take care.
Thanks, Matt. Bye-bye.